little bit. Can you hear me okay?
No. Hello. I can shout loud.
Good. Hello, that's better. Oh gosh, yeah, I'm echoing round the chamber. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see so many people here tonight in this beautiful council chamber in Leeds Civic Hall for climate question time. For anyone who doesn't know who I am, and that's probably a lot of you, I'm Christine Colbert, and I'm from ITV's calendar news programme, 6 o'clock weeknights every week. I'm delighted to introduce this special event here in Leeds for Green Great Britain Week. Now, we are live streaming from the venue tonight, as you can see, the cameras, if you want to give them a smile. So a very warm welcome if you're watching this on the University of Leeds YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to sort of go over it again, you can watch yourselves later. And obviously for social media purposes, hashtag ClimateQT or hashtag GreenGB or hashtag LeedsClimate if you want to tweet about what's going on here this evening. So tonight, you're going to be hearing from leading climate experts from universities and institutions, as well as representatives from the media and local government. And they'll all be taking your questions on climate change. Now, 10 days ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Am I echoing too much? Am I? Do you think it's that, you know, all the ghosts of this place are sort of coming out? Is that better? Yeah, okay. Now, that report stated that we have 12 years to halve our emissions, and by 2050, we need to be at zero carbon. And this is if we are to have any chance at all of limiting global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, the ambitious target which was set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. To go higher, to go to 2 degrees, risks more heat waves, heavier downpours, bigger droughts, and the risk in some areas that it may be impossible to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And even Donald Trump finally acknowledged climate change this week. So it could not be more topical or better time for us to be having this debate tonight. And we have experts on our panel who are very well placed to comment on it. And I suspect that our panellists will also have a bit to say about Donald Trump's views on climate change as well. Now, this event is the culmination of a week of coordinated activities conducted by some of our finest universities in the north of England. Researchers from Leeds, from York, from Newcastle, and from Manchester have been out on the streets and other public places talking to people and surveying them on their attitude to climate solutions. And this climate question time is presented jointly by the Priestley International Centre for Climate here at the university, the ESRC Centre for Climate Change, Economics and Policy, and by the Leeds Climate Commission. Now, the latter describes itself as enabling climate action in a can-do city, and that's how I think of Leeds. Obviously, I work and live here, and I know it's a gutsy, go-getting, positive place that's not afraid to innovate and take the lead. So if we are going to take on that enormous task of reducing our greenhouse emissions to nothing in just over 30 years, I may not be here then, but many of you will in this room, and your children, we're going to have to be bold, and we're going to have to change our ways. And that's not just down to all of us as individuals. What we do in our cities and our organisations and businesses is key. So I'm going to tell you something that you won't know, and that is that the television industry is taking a remarkable stance, which has seen all the main broadcasters and producers come together under a unified banner, and that's in order to reduce the impact that we have on our planet. And it's great to know that the industry that I work in is not only doing its bit, but it's actually changing things up and making very significant carbon savings of its own. So right here in Leeds, Calendar News was the first regional news team to gain BAFTA's certification for sustainable production. We've reduced the number of miles that our reporters travel to tell stories by reviewing our logistics, and we've also invested in new technology that allows our reporters to send their reports direct from the field without needing to travel back. So they get earlier to the pub, and it does the environment good as well. So a win-win situation for all of us. So ITV has done much more as well. Our studios in Leeds, just down the road on Kirkstall Road, if you've seen them, are powered by a 100% renewable energy deal. And we've also invested in plug-in hybrid vehicles for all of the Emmerdale team. So, yeah, so if you've ever seen Kane Dingle riding around in a plug-in vehicle, you know what he's up to. Probably more the production staff than the actual actors. We've got a zero to landfill waste contract, and our offices are all now fitted with LED lighting and eco-friendly air conditioning. And that's all positive, as I'm sure you'll all agree, but we have got to keep improving. But it's great that this is what we are doing so far. We're also trying to do more on screen by way of telling these stories through our programmes, and none more so than in the local news. We're inundated with stories, both regionally and nationally, about the planet, as you'll have seen recently, from extreme weather and air pollution to plastics in our oceans. It affects all of us as we go about our daily lives, and we feel it is our duty to bring that news to you in all of our homes. But you'll have seen recently only the floods in Mallorca, the tsunami, just last week. You know, the number of times that we're telling these stories is becoming quite worrying. It definitely is on the increase, and I've seen that change in my career over the last 25 years. And now I've also just lost my way. Hang on one moment. I think I'm just missing a... oh, no, I'm not. I've got it. Sorry about that, everybody. So, the reason I'd lost my way is because I was on the very last bit. It's my duty really just to say, have a wonderful evening. I'm going to hand you over now to our chair for Climate Question Time. That is Professor Andy Goulson. Now, Andy is Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of Leeds. He's also the Deputy Director of the ESRC Centre for Climate Change, Economics and Policy, and he's the Chair of the Leeds Climate Commission. He's an interdisciplinary social scientist, and for the last decade, he's focused specifically on climate change and on the case for and routes to low carbon and climate resilient development in cities. So a very worthy chairman for our debate tonight. Over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. If you're going to have a chair, I think I'd like one like this. It's quite fun, isn't it? So it's great to have you all here tonight and to introduce our Climate Question Time. Great also to have ITV here and presenting the great things you're doing, and to have them involved in the Leeds Climate Commission, which is a big innovation in various ways. Before we start, we have a few administrative things, really, kind of cabin doors to manual comments. So first one is the toilets. If you go out of the chamber here and turn right, and then through the doors at the end and then turn left, all of the toilets are down there. Also fire evacuation, there's no fire alarm scheduled for tonight, so if a bell goes off or a buzzer, then it's a real one. And we have to leave the chamber, go down, turn right out of the chamber, through the double doors, down the steps and out the way you came in. I'm sure there'll be people kind of herding us down in that direction. And a last one is that please can you all turn your mobile phones to silent. You can hear the acoustics and they'll all buzz and everything if you don't, so please do that now. Okay, so as Christine mentioned, today is part of a suite of events we're doing here in Leeds to do with the Green Great Britain Week, which is a national programme to celebrate and raise the profile of green issues across the UK. We've been doing a lot here. You may have already seen our My Climate messages in neon on the platform at the Leeds station. You may have even seen the film on the big screen in Millennium Square as you came in here tonight. And a lot of this is to do with communicating climate change and engaging with the public and stimulating the conversation around climate change and climate action and what can be done. And it's very timely, obviously, in the context of the IPCC report last week. As part of our engagements, we've engaged with lots of people, over 150 people in Leeds, And colleagues also have done similar things in Newcastle, in York and in Manchester. And what this has enabled us to do is to some extent kind of take the pulse of what the public are thinking about climate change and climate action. And what it's shown is that nearly 63% of the respondents are very concerned about climate change. So this is much higher than has been found in other surveys, such as the British Social Attitudes Survey, which has found that only 25% are worried are worried or extremely worried about climate change. So it seems that this is a real issue for the public. It's not a peripheral issue that's crowded out by other things like Brexit or austerity and so on. So in the survey, what we found is that 86% of people found that the effects of climate change are already being felt. And certainly in my work, we see this regularly wherever you work in the world, that people do see that the seasons are changing, or that the weather is messed up, or very kind of on the ground things about the impacts of longer term trends in climate. We also see that many people are willing to make changes to their own lives to address climate change. So, for example, in walking and cycling, cutting down on meat and dairy consumption, making homes more energy efficient, using public transport. 65% or more of people were willing to take those kind of changes, which is really positive. Renewable energy was also hugely popular. 70% or more of the survey were in favour, and there was great demand for government action and coordinated action with government, business, communities and individuals. So, we talk in academia of there being an issue and attention cycle, and these things being on a long-term pendulum, basically, that in the long term goes up, but also fluctuates a little bit. It would be great to think that now, after a few years of relatively being lower, that we're on the beginning of a trend where there's more climate concern and more climate action through the way we vote, the way we purchase, the way we consume, and so on. Some of the questions tonight have come from those surveys. We have a number of questions which have come from people sending them in advance, and we tried to pick a representative sample of those questions, and then there's time later for questions from the floor also. Crucially, we've invited colleagues here from universities that helped us in developing the Climate Solutions Survey, and also from the journalistic community and a key member of the Leeds City Council. So I'll give them all a minute to introduce themselves, and then we'll get straight to the questions. So can we start with the panel introducing themselves? Councillor Lewis, are you okay to start? Just 1 minute, and then we'll go along through the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to welcome to my office, but welcome to Leeds Civic Hall. I'm just going to take half of my minute. Just a very quick bit of history about this building. This building was built in the early 1930s in the middle of the Great Depression. It was a scheme that the council then devised to give work to unemployed labourers by building this building here. So not only is it sort of important building the civic history, but I think it's also got a great bit of history to it as well. I'm deputy leader of the council, and I'm responsible for resources and sustainability.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic to see such an amazing turnout. My name's Matt Hope. I'm the editor of DSMOG UK, which is an investigative journalism outlet, and we look at climate environmental issues. DSMOG UK was set up because the mainstream press has traditionally had a slightly difficult time covering environmental issues. I think last week's coverage of the IPCC report actually illustrated something of a step change in that coverage, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that tonight. But we got set up as an independent media outlet to try and address some of this. There's a couple of things that the mainstream press struggle with. One is checking private corporate interests, and in particular looking at industries like the fossil fuel industry and connecting the dots between those industries and issues like climate change. And the other one is environmental activism, where they don't necessarily know how to treat activists and activist communities and how to report on that issue. So DSMOG UK was set up to a certain extent to try and explore these issues in a deeper way, in an independent way, and communicate climate change in a slightly different way. We see climate change fundamentally as a political and social story, not as an environment story. And a lot of my comments tonight will probably reflect that, I hope. So yeah, thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all, and hopefully we're going to have a great debate.
Good evening everyone. So my name's Sarah Mander and I work at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research over at the University of Manchester. So I think I'm a reformed engineer. I then spent quite a few years setting up kind of workers and housing co-ops, and now I've kind of found my spiritual home with my other kind of climate change nerds at the Tyndall Centre in Manchester, where my work is very much about people and low carbon technology.
Hello everyone, I'm Hayley Fowler. I'm based at the School of Engineering in Newcastle University. I'm Professor of Climate Change Impacts there. My research group and myself, the main things we look at really are around extreme events, and in particular thinking about the impacts of floods and droughts, thinking about how the frequency and intensity of events are changing around the world, and also how they're likely to perhaps become worse in the future. We're also thinking a little bit at the moment about how we can start to forecast flash flood events in the UK more effectively, together with the Flood Forecast Centre at the Met Office.
Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for turning up. My name is Piers Forster. I'm one more professor from the University of Leeds, but I think what I'm doing here tonight is that I was one of the authors of this IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, and I spent the last 2 years in my life producing it, and we spent 10 days out in South Korea having really challenging, tough negotiations about it with 180 delegations from different countries. For the last 2 days, I slept for 3.5 hours. Then I was up for 48 hours straight, negotiating all the time on a podium like this with all the delegates in front of me, in fact, and it's been one of the most hardest and most challenging documents I think that we've ever produced. So, but I think what didn't come across, in fact, particularly perhaps as well as it might have done, is that it is a real optimistic document. It's a document not about the issues so much, although they're obviously there and they're very significant. It's far more a document about the solutions, and it does tell the whole world, in fact, that if we do act early and we act together, we can not only solve the problem of climate change, we can build a richer and better world for all our tomorrows. So that is basically what I want to get across to everyone. Cheers.
So just to say, you look very good on sleep deprivation in that case.
I'm not.
Okay, so my name is Lisa Emberson. I'm the Centre Director from the Stockholm Environment Institute, which happens to have a centre in York. As part of the University of York, we sit within the Environment and Geography Department at the university. The Stockholm Environment Institute is an international research centre looking at sustainable development issues around the globe, and we have about 8 different centres which span places in Europe and Latin America and Africa and Asia. My personal research focuses on air pollution and climate change. And one of the things in York that we've been particularly looking at are some species called short-lived climate pollutants, which are damaging human health, but are also enhancing climate change. And by tackling those pollutants in particular, we feel that we can make some really big benefits, both for climate change and for human health and for agricultural productivity as well. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. So we're going to start our process with questions from the floor. Just before I do that, can I just remind you that this is being live streamed on the University of Leeds YouTube channel, and that there are various Twitter links that you can participate in. So there are hashtags, hashtag ClimateQT, also hashtag Leeds Climate, and hashtag GreenGB. So please do engage and get involved in that online conversation as well. So, first question from Kat Rowland.
Do you believe in a climate tipping point, and if so, when do you think it will be reached?
Great, thank you very much. Hayley, could you begin to take that question?
Yeah, okay. So I think it's really interesting the way the question's phrased to start with, and I think this is something that comes up again and again in climate change, this idea of belief, really, in terms of science. It's not something we think about as scientists. You know, we actually look at facts. So I think it's an interesting way of phrasing the question. I mean, but we can look at basically what the facts tell us about tipping points, and when scientists think that those might be reached. So there was some information in the last report, the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, on tipping points, and they identified a number of different tipping points that we need to consider, really, going forward into the future. And I suppose the good news is that very few of those they thought would actually be something that would be reached this century, in terms of certainly abrupt changes. And when I'm talking about abrupt changes, I'm talking about something that might happen over, say, a few years, or perhaps a decade, or a couple of decades. So something that's going to happen quite fast in terms of the climate system, at least. And so when we're thinking about some of these tipping points, some of the ones they identified were things like, for example, the melting of the Arctic ice, for example, and that's, they think perhaps a tipping point has already been reached, in terms of the fact that we will see ice-free summers in the Arctic within a few decades, probably. There's other tipping points as well that they've considered, things like the melting of the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, and of course that's really important in terms of sea level rise. And if the Antarctic ice sheet melted, we'd see something like a 60-metre sea level rise globally. Of course, it's not very likely to happen in the next decade or so. Indeed, the East Antarctic ice sheet is actually quite stable. The West Antarctic ice sheet, because a lot of the glaciers are actually directly go into the ocean, they are moving much more rapidly into the ocean in recent years. And in fact, the Greenland ice sheet as well would contribute something like a 7-metre increase in sea level rise as well. I think that those are things to be thinking about, but the main concern, I think, in terms of some of these tipping points are some of the processes that I suppose have the potential to actually provide an abrupt climate change in the future. We don't know whether they will or they won't, but things like, for example, the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic. I don't know how many of you have heard of Arctic amplification, but this is the idea that, and it's something that's actually happening, basically that the Arctic is actually warming at a greater rate than the rest of the globe. And that's to do with the fact that we're seeing a reduction in ice in that area. You get an increase, well, a decrease in the albedo, basically, and so you get less reflection of solar radiation back to space. You get this amplification effect. And it's these feedback effects actually that make a lot of difference, and this is why these tipping points are actually quite important. So one of the things we need to think about are hydrates, which is basically methane, that are frozen into both the land and the ocean. And where in the land they're called frozen into the permafrost, and in the ocean they're called ocean clathrates. And these are basically frozen at the moment, and them staying there depends on temperature and also pressure in the ocean as well. So the pressure coming down from the sea above. So we can imagine, for example, that as we see warming, you actually get much more methane released from particularly the land-based permafrost. And that obviously has this positive feedback effect. So you get more methane released, more warming, and that then melts more permafrost. So you get this positive feedback effect. And there has been some thought given to whether we might at some point reach some tipping point where we get a runaway climate change, if you like, a runaway process happening. Now scientists, obviously our models don't suggest that that will be the case within the next 100 years at least, but we can never rule that out entirely. So I mean, I think that some of these tipping points are really important to consider. I don't think we necessarily have a good idea about when we might reach them. But yeah, because of these very crucial feedbacks in the climate system, they're very important to consider.
Thank you, Hayley. Are there any of the other panellists want to add something to that?
Sorry, I thought I was going to not say a thing, but in fact I want to say something now. Because yeah, you're right about the tipping point just for the geophysical system of the Earth, but there are tons of tipping points out there for societies and for species and for biodiversity, and we're passing them all the time, okay? And we expect with 1.5 degrees, thousands of different species will become extinct, and if we go to 2 degrees, we'll wipe out 99% of corals, and we wipe out 80% of them at 1.5. So we're passing these tipping points all the time. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. So in terms of impacts, there's lots of critical thresholds that we will reach all the time. Yeah.
Okay, any other comments from the public? A fascinating one in my world is about the level of urbanisation and how quickly we are urbanising, and you know, there are some forecasts which suggest that half of the world's infrastructure will be built before 2030 on top of what we have now. So there's, you know, the IPCC report saying we have 11 years to do something serious. In the urban case is absolutely right. We have to radically rethink the way that we build cities or that cities develop in order to not lock them into a very high carbon future, which will then, you know, be part of that kind of process of locking us into very significant future climate emissions. Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is from Christopher Smith.
Good evening. What have we learned about convincing skeptics, and how is this shaping how we talk publicly about climate change today?
Thank you very much. Matt, will you take this one?
Sure, thank you. Good question, really interesting question. So I think perhaps the most important thing to do at the beginning of that question is point out that there's not one type of climate change skeptic, and there kind of hasn't been for a long time now. In the UK in particular, there's actually very few people, as the surveys show us, who don't think climate change is happening. For example, the vast majority of people do. Some of the debate is around whether or not humans cause that. Sorry, I seem to have a hoover in my microphone, I apologise. The debate really is around whether or not humans are causing that, but again, actually most people in the UK think humans are causing that. The issue, as Andy pointed out with the survey, is that there's kind of not that much concern about the urgency of this problem. People may believe it's true and it's real, but they don't really want to do anything about it. And there's a bunch of people that we maybe describe as impact skeptics. So they say, okay, well, it's real, humans are causing it, but it's not going to be that bad. So we don't really need to change anything. We can continue down the status quo path. And when you're dealing with that, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to communicate, well, this isn't really so much a cost to address these things, it's an investment. So there's a famous cartoon that basically lays out all of the good things that would happen if we address climate change. You know, cities would be greener, air would be cleaner, we'd all walk around a lot more, we'd all have a much nicer quality of life. Green jobs are good jobs, you know, you're not going down the mine anymore. Okay, so who cares really if climate change is real or not in that case? That's just a nice place to live, that's just a good place to live. And all the things we do to get there are investments, not necessarily costs. Now in the US, it's obviously a slightly different situation. At the top end of government, you know, we have someone who basically doesn't believe climate change is real, doesn't really think it's a problem. He sort of flits between whether or not he actually thinks it's real or not. You know, you have to check it now to kind of work out whether or not he thinks it's real. But that's a slightly different thing. And now the problem with that is that's fundamentally anti-science, right? Which is a slightly different problem. It's anti-expert. And we do have an element of that coming over into the UK. You probably remember Michael Gove before Brexit, talking about Brexit rather than the environment, saying, well, you know, people are sick of experts. Now that's a kind of different problem, because if people are sick of experts, well then where do we go for answers about problems? You know, and then in terms of communicating climate change, the job of journalists then is to do a bit more due diligence on who our experts are. Be honest that there are people who talk about this problem who aren't qualified to talk about this problem or talk about this issue, who do have a corporate or private interest in this issue or promoting the status quo, possibly calling them out on air or possibly not inviting them on in the first place. But that's an important thing that journalists can do to address this issue. It's essentially to protect, perhaps that's too strong a word, but to look after this idea of expertise and this idea of truth, particularly scientific truth, when it comes to climate change. And again, I think that's something we've learned about this issue over the years, is don't just ask anyone about this problem. It is complicated, and there are very good people to ask. So ask them, ask these people. And I think that's where we maybe started to improve a bit.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah, I think it's also about, a lot of it is about the stories that we tell about climate change. So, I mean, I'm someone, I unashamedly, I love graphs. And, you know, I love charts, but not everyone's like me. And so I think it's also about the stories that we tell and understanding that kind of, that we all reflect, you know, we reflect our politics, we reflect our values, we reflect our, you know, our social circumstances, who we hang out with, where we live. And so as scientists, I think what we should be doing is not telling stories about climate change, but kind of telling stories that fit with the different values that people have. So as Matt was saying, I shouldn't be saying like you should be doing this because it's something that reduces emissions, but rather, you know, let's paint a vision of actually the world we want to live in, where we want our communities to be, what we want our lives to be like, how healthy we want to be. And actually measures that address climate change actually in many ways address climate change as a secondary thing. They also help us, you know, give the communities and the society that we want to live in. So yeah, I think it's very much about the stories that we can tell as well.
So do you think, going back to Donald Trump, unfortunately, that he's right in saying that some of us as climate scientists or as environmentalists have an agenda that we're trying to smuggle through under the banner of climate change?
No, I don't think he's right, is the short answer. It's a hell of a ruse if it is. I mean, as Piers sort of said, you know, just getting all those scientists in one place to talk about each line of this ginormous scientific report, I mean, that's more investment than any prank I've ever heard. You know, that's insane. So no, I don't think that's true. As far as the agenda goes, well, again, you know, it depends. Like, it depends what kind of future world you want to live in. And I think this is where, as you were saying, telling stories comes in. Because if you're telling the stories of what a climate-friendly future actually looks like, it's a nicer society, it's a better place to be. And it's the job of both climate scientists and journalists to connect those dots and explain that climate policy, like I say, isn't necessarily a cost where you have to stop doing lots of things necessarily. You may have to change your behaviour, but that doesn't necessarily mean stopping doing all the things you love. And I think that's the important thing. So if we have an agenda, it's that we want to live somewhere nice. And we want our kids to live somewhere nice, and we want our grandkids to live somewhere nice and good and healthy. And I think that's, you know, not such a terrible agenda if we do have one.
In fact, I'm going to come in a slightly challenging manner. I'm going to slightly agree with Trump. Wait, Trump. Just because we as scientists do know that climate change oughtn't to be political, okay? It's a fact, it is occurring. We see it occurring, we know called by us, and we do know that we will damage our society if we don't address it. But there are definitely people on both sides of the political spectrum that clearly are turning it into a political thing. And perhaps it ought to be. Perhaps we ought to really have the overthrow of capitalism, or perhaps we can still be capitalist type economist and go over the big developments, and perhaps we can still solve climate change through technology and through capitalist billionaires. So, and I'm still not completely fixated on the overthrow of capitalism quite yet. Anyway, I want to say.
It appears you just agreed with Trump and supported ongoing capitalism. We could discuss this later, maybe. Okay, let's move on instead. Third question is from Craig. Is it Poku or Poku?
Poku. Yes. So the question is, what measures are necessary to realistically keep below the 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, and over what time scale? In particular, what does this mean for continued car use and plane use?
Okay, Sarah.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Craig. I mean, I think this is a really nice question because it starts us getting sort of thinking about the kind of the solutions and unfortunately, I suppose, the scale of the challenge, which may or may not be about overthrowing capitalism. So what measures are necessary? I think kind of everything that we know how to do, and possibly a few things that we're not totally sure how to do yet. So, I mean, just going back to the IPCC report, kind of Christine sort of summarised the scale of the challenge that we've got ahead of us, which is reducing our carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 and then to net zero by 2050. And if we just compare that to the scale of the challenge for 2 degrees, we're talking about having to sort of bring everything that we would have done to get to 2 degrees forward by a couple of decades, which is, you know, kind of then implies a huge ramping up in terms of the speed in which we've got to do stuff. I mean, 12 years, that's actually not very far away. And it's also worth reflecting on the fact that at the moment the pledges that countries have made under the Paris Agreement are in line with 3 degrees, so not even 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. And thinking more specifically about the UK, we don't have the policies in place yet to reach our 2030 carbon budgets. So, but you know, I think the thing about the IPCC report as well is that things in it are more or less technically feasible. So, I mean, in the short term, Andy's talked about some of the really important things that we need to do, which is about reducing demand for energy, which is just sort of very much neglected by governments and hugely, hugely powerful. Because, I mean, in the time that it would take to build a nuclear power station, for example, people might have replaced particular appliances 2 or 3 times. So energy efficiency can bring about big reductions very quickly, and it's making those quick reductions that are essential. And so we're talking about things like insulating homes, installing LED lighting, using our cars less, walking, cycling, using public transport for journeys, and those are all things that we can do now, and that also have kind of co-benefits in terms of health or in terms of, you know, how much money we have. If we take the UK, and I'll look at this, I suppose, electricity, heat and transport in turn. So by 2030, all our electricity has to be zero carbon. And so that's electricity from renewables, so solar, wind, that might be onshore, offshore, some hydro, there may or may, nuclear power. We're already phasing out coal, but by 2030, we won't be able to burn gas in power stations unless those power stations are fitted with something called carbon capture and storage. Now, carbon capture and storage is a technology where you take the carbon dioxide from the flue gases of point sources, so fossil fuel power stations or different industrial sources, and then you compress that carbon dioxide and then you transport it and you inject it into a rock formation. So in the UK, we do have a lot of reservoir capacity that's offshore, a lot of it in the North Sea, and so those rock formations initially might be in depleted oil and gas fields, and you're looking at injecting the CO2, the carbon dioxide, into kind of rock formations which are about 1 kilometre below the seabed. This is a technology which is being. There are commercial examples other places in the world, but it's something that we have spectacularly failed to do so far in the UK, despite kind of having sort of flirted with carbon capture and storage for at least 10 years. The thing about carbon capture and storage is that it then enables you to decarbonise industry. And there are very few options if we actually want to have industry 2030, 2050, that we can make that zero carbon. Carbon capture and storage also opens up ways of decarbonising heat, which, being in Leeds, some people here may be aware of. So we get about 1/3 of our carbon dioxide emissions are from heat. And whereas with electricity, we know what to do. With decarbonising heat, there's a lot of different options that depend very much on what your buildings are like, what resources you have locally, and so on. So you might be looking at heat networks, low carbon heat networks, with the energy coming from bioenergy, or ideally, if you live somewhere with industry, you could use waste heat from that industry in order to heat homes through a district heating scheme, say. Now, something that's being looked at for Leeds is a project called Leeds H21, I think, which is looking at replacing using hydrogen for heating in the natural gas grid. And so that, in order to make that hydrogen, you're relying on carbon capture and storage to make that zero carbon. And then other options for heating for people maybe in rural areas where you're not on the gas grid, you might be looking at electricity, for example, through the use of heat pumps. But heat it's complex, it's challenging, it's very kind of place specific, and realistically by 2050 we have to have kind of worked out how we're going to do that and deployed that infrastructure across the whole country. We've then got another 1/3 of our emissions that come from transport, and we're already seeing the kind of the start of that low carbon transition within transport, with the kind of transition to electric vehicles. And it's quite weird to think that my kids are never going to learn to drive a car where they have to change gears. That may be a good thing. I think the thing about the sort of shift to electric vehicles is that we're missing a huge opportunity if all we think about is that everyone who has a petrol or diesel car kind of shifts to an electric vehicle, because that doesn't solve problems with congestion, it doesn't solve problems of access to transport for people who can't afford a car or who are unable to drive. So I think the exciting thing about the transport is the kind of the opportunities it opens up to think about transport differently, and to kind of think, okay, I'm not going to think about owning a car as such. I might own a car club card, which gives me different ways of accessing mobility, or I might kind of feel a greater sense of ownership over these streets that are now safer, or less congested, and where there's more social space, more active travel, slower travel. So what else can I talk about? Oh, you asked about aviation. So I would say that there is no space for airport expansion with a 1.5 degree target. There is no short-term technical solution for decarbonising aviation. So I think we are very much looking at reducing our demand for aviation. So people who fly will have to fly less, and I think that's just one of those things, really. I think so. Technically, this is the exciting thing, but also the frustrating thing, is that technically we know what the solutions are, but the problem it comes down to politics and that political will.
Thank you. Lisa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose sort of asking a bit of a question back, really, in terms of, some of those things that you're talking about are going to mean that we're going to have some quite large behavioural changes in terms of the way the public and all of us are tackling climate change and emissions. How do you sort of mentioned the government responsibility in terms of trying to make some of those changes happen? Where do you think government responsibility compared to just public responsibility lies? And where do you think public responsibility in terms of really trying to push the governments to be doing something, where does that sit as well?
Can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Did you hear that?
I did hear that. I think it's been very easy up until now for governments to say that they don't have a mandate, because actually many people are, possibly, most of these people in the room, we're very good at making those kind of individual choices about what we eat or how we travel or how we light our homes. But for this kind of way, the scale of changes that is required, it's a massive systemic change that needs government, that needs businesses, and until our politicians believe that they're not going to get elected, then they won't make the changes that we need. And as someone who's been doing this for quite a while, I go through these cycles, and often I get quite cross, because I'm like, well, you've had this you have all this data and this evidence that suggests that tells you what you have to do, but kind of the answer always comes back, well, until politicians believe that they will lose their jobs because they're not making those changes, then nothing will change. So, yeah.
I think this is an aspect we'll come back to later, actually. It's a recurrent theme throughout the whole debate. Let's move on to the next question then, from Jennifer Rodley.
Given that animal agriculture contributes around 14.5% towards global greenhouse gas emissions, do you advocate towards a plant-based diet to address this issue?
Lisa, back to you, if that's right.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay.
Is there another microphone just to your right that you could...
Is it not working?
There's one more directly in front of you without a light on it.
Put them all on.
How many microphones can I have? Does that can people hear me? Does that work?
Go a bit closer.
Okay, that's good. I think you can hear me, can't you now? Yeah. Okay, so yes, another very interesting question. Thank you. And I thought maybe just to try and give some background as to why emissions that are resulting from animal-based agriculture are particularly important might be useful as a first start. So the agricultural sector is second only to the energy sector in terms of actually creating or producing greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of emissions from agriculture, then we have sort of two main areas where the emissions are coming from. The first, you could sort of think of a little bit in terms of directly from animals. So we have methane emissions coming from enteric fermentation, which gives me the opportunity to say burps and farts is basically where that's coming from in terms of animals. But then we also have emissions coming from trying to dispose of the manure that comes from animals as well. And that probably makes up over half of the emissions that's coming from that whole agricultural sector. Those are the direct emissions, but we also have indirect emissions as well, because our animals need to be fed our food, and that food can be grown. And if we're growing that food, then we might be, for example, converting land use, so from a forest to an agricultural system. In that conversion, you might lose carbon from the soil. If the carbon's lost from the soil, then it enters into the atmosphere and you have an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, which is an increase in your greenhouse gas emissions as well. And if you're also producing feed, then you'll probably be using fertiliser application, which produces N2O, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. And then you might also be using some other agricultural management practices, such as burning of crop residues, which will kick CO2 into the atmosphere as well. So there are a lot of emissions associated with the production of animals for agriculture. There was a study which also looked at the amount of calories, or the amount of land that would be needed to produce calories. So 36% of calories produced by the world's crops are actually being used for animal feed, and only 12% of those feed calories ultimately contribute to the human diet. So you have this conversion factor problem as well in terms of animal-based products, as opposed to if you would just use plant-based products. So given all of that, would a plant-based diet help? Yes, I think that the answer is a definitive yes. There was a UK study in 2014 which actually estimated the emissions in kilograms of CO2 equivalents per day for different diets, and they looked at 5 or 6 different diets. They looked at high meat eaters, which is somebody who was eating over 100 grams per day of meat. They would be emitting, or the production of that meat would lead to the emission of something like 7 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per day. And you can compare that with a vegan diet, which actually led to 3 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per day. So there's a big difference in terms of the diets and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those. There was another study which also looked at the savings that you would get if you looked at diets just as we have them today and assumed that there was a business as usual in those diets compared to going to different diets all the way down to a vegan diet. And they found that you could make greenhouse gas emission savings of somewhere between 34 and 64%. So there are big savings to be had from us changing diets. That said, though, there are also some reasons why we might still want to be eating meat. One of them is the fact that some of our land is just not suitable for cropping anyway, and that land is suitable for grasslands and having livestock actually grazing on those grasslands. And those livestock are important in terms of contributing to food security, especially in some countries in Africa and Asia. We also can bear in mind the fact that greenhouse gas emissions from livestock products will vary quite considerably depending on which livestock or animal product you're consuming. So the highest greenhouse gas emissions tend to be associated with beef. You'll have lower greenhouse gas emissions associated with things like pork and chicken. So depending on what you eat will also depend on the emissions that you end up producing. And where the meat is produced will also affect greenhouse gas emissions. In general terms, Europe and North America, we tend to have lower greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production, whereas in Asia, Latin America and Africa, the emissions tend to be higher. That does also mean that there are potential benefits by actually trying to bring in adaptation methods, better agricultural practices in those regions to actually try and reduce emissions. So, what could we actually do, and what would be the implications of doing things? I'm just sort of thinking of some of the things that we might all consider. I think there's been some noises in the press about trying to sort of ensure that consumers are paying a higher premium for meat, so perhaps paying the true cost, the externalities associated with meat production. So this would mean that it might lead to an increase in farmers' profit margins and perhaps reduce the focus on farmers actually producing a large volume of meat and rather focusing on trying to improve agricultural meat production practices better. But it's actually quite difficult to increase the price of meat in times when we have issues surrounding food poverty and equity and so on. There are some problems there. We can reduce the amount of meat that we consume, and that might also be something beneficial for our health and put less stress on the National Health Service, which is currently dealing with an obesity crisis. But at the same time, that will have implications for livestock producers. So people's livelihoods that are involved in that would potentially suffer. Maybe some things that we could do are sort of providing more information to people so we can start to label products so people know the level of greenhouse gas emissions associated with certain meat products. And I think probably one of the really important things that we can really be thinking about doing is trying to reduce food waste. So not necessarily thinking about, well, changing diets is one thing, but actually reducing the amount of food that's wasted. Something like 30 to 40% of all food produced is lost in the supply chain from harvest to consumption. And in the UK, about 64% of food waste is avoidable. And it's actually costing a UK household on average something like £470 a year in food waste. So it would seem like a very beneficial thing to do to not waste food. Thank you.
Thank you. We're running slightly behind time, so quick comments if that's all right, and then we'll move on.
I just had a really quick comment. It's a bit of a sort of tangential thing, but the solution, of course, is to eat insects instead. I was reading a really interesting article about this. It's something we should actually be thinking about in the Western world. It's something that's abhorrent to us, but actually they are very low carbon, they're very high protein, they're very low fat. And what we need to do is to think they're very easy to produce in volume. I'm not saying I necessarily want to eat them, but you know, we wouldn't be trying to eat them in the same way they eat them in Thailand, for example. But actually, it's a really interesting idea, actually, in the sense of what can you produce as foodstuffs that would be palatable to a Western diet, but actually does massively reduce carbon while giving people the sort of the equivalent of what you get from meat.
And just to come back really quickly on that, I think there was also a study which was trying to work out how you could encourage people to eat insects. And they found that actually telling people the sort of environmental benefits of it didn't really help. But if you tried to show it as a fashionable, trendy, faddy thing to do, then that went down really well. So again, it's getting the message across to people.
In my experience, it can come if you promote cycling, actually. Right, our next question. Simon Bowens.
In the week that fracking has started in Lancashire against the wishes of the local community, does the panel think a UK fracking industry can be compatible with the radical changes needed to restrict temperature rises to 1.5 degrees?
Piers.
Oh, cheers, Andy.
It's all right.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Well, to frack or not to frack, that is definitely not the question. Can I ask the audience, who in the audience wants to start fracking in Lancashire? What about here? What about here? We did it in North Yorkshire. Anyone? Well, I mean, we talked about what we have to do to get to 1.5 degrees, and it's huge, okay? We have to cut our emissions by half in the next 10 years, or even further. And to do that, we need to think much bigger. We need to plant lots of trees across the North York Moor, the York Dales, and we can really do big things in this part of the country. We do have the biggest power station in the country that's burning bioenergy. We could turn that into the world's very first example of a bioenergy and carbon capture and storage facility. And if we were to make that one single change, in fact, we would instantly turn all of York's zero carbon. So we can make big change like that. We can produce zero carbon cars in Newcastle. We can export them, and we can solve not only our problem, we can solve some of the other world problems. We can export zero carbon wind turbines from offshore wind turbines. And if we get our act together, there are so many opportunities within this part of the world. We can not only get ourselves to zero carbon very in that 10-year time frame, we can really benefit the rest of the world to get there too. So we have to think much bigger than that, and we have to really start to put things first. We need to do big.
So IPCC training in media training and not answering questions coming in. Matt.
Thank you very much. I mean, Piers put it really well. I mean, DSmog UK has done a lot of work on fracking. It's a new fossil fuel industry. IPCC have just told us we need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. You know, if there's some crazy technical scenario where it can fit 1.5 degrees, then fine. But it just seems like it doesn't really work. what I find really interesting about the fracking debate is it's an example of climate change being a political story, or climate change being a government electoral issue, which is live right now. So the local community don't want it, the local government didn't want it, said no, the national government forced it through. The Conservatives, the only mainstream political party out of all the political parties who want it, this is a live political issue. And if we are going to turn climate change policy into a serious political issue, well, this is the sort of thing that has to really matter beyond environmentalists, beyond greenies. Right? So if this is an issue where clearly it's a minority, and it's an elite minority who are pushing it through for whatever reason, they're pushing it through against the will of the people, well, this is an opportunity for the people, not just the environmental community, to stand up and say, no, in this case, other things matter more. Climate change matters more. Local democracy matters more. We're not going to have this. So there's that. To try and put a little bit more of a positive spin on that, I've been up and spent a bit of time at Preston Euro fracking site, not much, but I've been up a few times and spent a few days with the campaigners there and with the activists at the camp there. And DSMOG UK quite regularly sends reporters up there. What's been really interesting is seeing the sense of meaning that some of the people who are participating in those campaigns have got from campaigning on what is essentially a climate issue, is essentially an environmental issue. You know, these are people who before a lot of them would describe themselves as people who liked the police and thought the police were great, who thought local government worked, you know. They're sort of middle-class residents of quite a nice little place up in Lancashire, who thought that the system was on their side and have suddenly discovered actually it's not, in this specific case, it's not. So the positive message I take from that is, well, actually, if we do need this radical change, if we do need people to be voting with their feet, turning things into political issues, turning climate change into a political issue, this is sort of what that looks like, right? And who knows what will happen in Lancashire, who knows what will happen in that particular world, who knows what will even happen with the fracking industry. But if we genuinely care about doing things that Piers and that the IPCC report are talking about, then this is the kind of political action that we need to take notice of and note, and governments and MPs and politicians and policymakers and local governments need to pay attention to and take note of. This is climate change as politics.
This is a huge issue, and I'm sure we could debate this and many of the other questions much more fully. Maybe it has been debated here in this chamber before, but James, do you want to comment quickly?
Although I'm a Leeds councillor, my ward isn't like most of Leeds because it's quite a large rural area, and we're under the threat of fracking at the moment, and what Matt said is absolutely true. People who haven't really been interested in what goes on in their local area, to be perfectly honest, are really energised by the campaign against fracking. We've taken a view as a city council that we're opposed to fracking, and made that statement 2 or 3 years ago. But as anybody's been following the Lancashire case or the North Yorkshire case will know, it doesn't really carry a lot of weight in a planning system that is loaded in favour of allowing fracking to go ahead. And like you say, it's a much longer debate, but I'll leave it there. But it is, you know, it is a real issue in Leeds, and it is a real issue for people living in Leeds, and it does get people on what could be quite people apologise for me saying this, a dry academic issue, into one that actually makes this a real, a very real issue about how people see and view the place they live in and how it's governed.
Thank you. We need to press on, so our next question is from Anita Shaw.
How do we work for the benefit of the whole planet against governments who are apparently looking after private interests?
Great question. Matt, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Great question. And it leads on really nicely, I think, from the question we just had, from the issue we were just talking about. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I won't take much time on this. I mean, the first thing I think to say is that information is power. So when politicians are working on, on behalf of private interests, find that out and expose that. And that's what DSMOG UK spends an awful lot of time doing. We try and join those dots between people who are acting a particular way or saying particular things that are maybe not true or maybe have interest behind them, and join those dots and show where the money's come from. So that's the first thing. Find these things out, go to journalists, talk to journalists, become a citizen journalist, whatever you want to do, and make sure the information gets out there. The other thing to say is, well, actually flip that problem on its head. So make acting in a climate-friendly way good for the private interests. Make that profitable for companies, or more to the point, make polluting unprofitable. Make the polluter pay for the damage they do. And this is where kind of the fracking thing comes in, right? So the only way that you can obviously do that is by influencing things like regulation, government policy, maybe doing corporate boycotts. Sometimes that works. You know, that can change corporate behaviour. For example, I wouldn't be buying shares in plastic straws right now. You know, that's a terrible business. They're going to lose loads of money now. Okay, and that's because, you know, for whatever reason, David Attenborough being a large part of that, people really care about that right now. Okay, so this can work. So flip the problem on its head and make acting in a climate-friendly way in the interest of the private interest, then you kind of don't have the problem of the politicians acting in the negative private interest.
Anyone else want to come in quickly on that from the panel? It's an interesting issue, and I think if you look at the energy sector, you can see that the market may drive change much more rapidly in the next years than government can. And maybe in our neoliberal world, the market has much more legitimacy than governments do in some instances. So, you know, up to a point in some areas, I think there's scope for some optimism about action beyond what governments are doing. Let's move on to our next question from Kate Sandbrook.
So I'm actually asking this question on behalf of a lot of the survey respondents. So what is the government doing to tackle climate change locally?
Councillor Lewis, James.
Hi, Kate. I can talk about what the council's doing. What the council's doing locally. I was just interested in some of the ideas already. One of the services I'm responsible for is school dinners, so I'm looking at putting insects on the school on the menu for on the menu for schools in Leeds. I think I was sort of trying to. Rather than giving a sort of a long, maybe laundry list of answers, I'm sort of trying to put it into a couple of sort of broad areas. I think first of all, in terms of emissions overall, we've set our targets of 40% reduction of carbon dioxide by 2020 up to 80% by 2050. And we know we're already on target for our 2020 target. A lot of that has come from changing the mix of electricity generation, but some of that has come from the work we've done in the city on reducing energy usage and making things more efficient. I think the second area is quite an interesting one. Again, coming back to the question about how do you sell some of this to people? And actually, a lot of it is about encouraging people to take part in initiatives. A lot of it is, after 8 years of austerity, it's actually about reducing cost and reducing costs. So, as people might know, local governments had deeper austerity than any other part of the public sector. So anything we can do not to spend money unnecessarily and focus on what we have to spend money on is really helpful. So there's lots of initiatives, whether it's moving over to electric vehicles rather than diesel vehicles. Again, great environmental impact, great air quality impact, but also cheaper for us as a council. So that's a winner for us. Things like we're running a district heating scheme. It's powered by our waste incinerator. I know it's not everybody's favourite energy source, but there's a lot of heat going up the chimney there that we can actually use to heat businesses and homes, and do that in a way that provides people with a lot cheaper heat and provide businesses with a lot cheaper heat. And because it's linked to us, a much more constant cost than other things. There are things we can do around some of the poor quality housing in Leeds. So in the area I'm a councillor for, we have a lot of coal board houses that were built by the coal board for the mining industry. They were single skin buildings because obviously miners got free coal, if people remember back to those days. So you didn't need insulation, you just threw some more free coal on your fire, and that's how you warmed your house up. And we've done a lot of work on insulation schemes on those, which again are reducing emissions, are reducing energy use, but also for the people living there means it's they've got a cosier house and it's cheaper for them to heat. So there's a lot of work around that we're doing. And I think the final point again is on some of the infrastructure we've got in the city. So back to the debate about whether we should overthrow capitalism. The first place I'd start in this country in overthrowing capitalism is in the running of public transport. That's an area where we have a lot of privatised and deregulated services out there, and I think we could do a lot better on the sort of the scale and the depth and the cost of our public transport network. I think there are things we could do in terms of done things like, again, It's not reducing the overall number of car journeys, but trying to stop people driving to the city centre where we've got particular air quality issues around park and ride, trying to encourage people not to make that last bit of the journey into the city centre. So there's a huge amount of things. I think the other thing as well, which kind of links into this, is, again, I come back to the area I'm a council for, is actually mitigating the impact of climate change. So I was first elected in 2003, and for the first 4 years, I never dealt with flooding. Then in 2007, my ward sort of to the far southeast, so the River Aire and the River Calder run through it. In 2007, we had some quite severe flooding from the rivers, and people were told, oh, this is a, you know, it's catastrophic, but it's a 1 in 100 year event. So of course it happened a year after. And as having not happened at that scale for a long time since the 1960s, it's happened again and again and again. So there's a huge amount of work that's been put in the city as a whole to actually on sort of, you know, some very physical work around mitigating the impact of climate change. Again, you know, just from my work as a councillor in the area, there's lots of small scale things. A lot of the drainage infrastructure that's been around for decades doesn't cope now. It coped 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It doesn't cope now with heavy rainfall, and that can it might sound like small stuff in sort of the bigger picture I'm talking about, but actually if you're having your house filled with raw sewerage once every couple of years, which unfortunately happens, and it is a big issue, and that's a lot of work that we're having to do to mitigate the impact of climate change. And I think that, you know, that is sort of a big part of what we're having to do. But I still think a lot of the work we're doing around trying to stop it in the first place is really, really important.
Great, thank you very much. There's so much more we could say on so many of these issues, but we're going to press on and open the floor to some questions. So if you do have a question, can you raise your hand? Can you name, say what your name is? And also there should be a drawer in front of you, which if you pull it open, there should be a little red button. If you press that button, hopefully nothing too bad will happen, but a light will come on. There you go. Okay, so seeing as you've worked it out, we're going to go straight ahead to the woman in front. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, given the moral and financial arguments for divestment, as referred to recently by the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, when do you think Leeds Council and Leeds University, but referring to Leeds Council, when will you call on West Yorkshire Pension Fund to divest from fossil fuel investments?
We have done and haven't is a simple answer to that.
Is that on record that you've done that?
Yes.
Okay. So what are your next plans then?
Just to give a longer answer to that, people that work for the council are offered the chance to become members of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. The West Yorkshire Pension Fund isn't part of the council, it's run by its own trustees. And like I say, we put it to the trustees on a number of occasions, the concerns that have been raised with us, and they have come back with a response to say that it's not within their, whatever it is, duties to do so and to come out of fossil fuels. So that's the, you know, I'd love to give you a different answer to that, but that's the one, that's the position we're in at the moment.
Maybe we could talk about that later, because I think there's a couple of issues I'd like to discuss with you there. I disagree, actually. I mean, I can say that now if we've got time.
No, we're going to move on if that's all right. As interesting as it is. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Question over here.
Yeah, on the topic of local approaches to tackling climate change, what do you think, what are your thoughts on the use of local currencies to indirectly tackle air pollution, and do you think there's a future for it in the UK?
Anybody want to tackle that? I think local currencies can be incredibly important. However, I think there's a kind of spectrum of local currency kind of approaches which are relevant, and one of those would be to think about localizing investment. You know, so for example, there's research done here which suggests that there's £5 billion in people's ISAs within Leeds. And if we could access that money to ensure that it's invested in low carbon development and in climate resilience within the city, so instead of people leaving their money in you know, faceless funds from, you know, the other side of the world, that they invest it in their own city, and they see real social and economic and environmental benefits from that investment, to me that's a kind of local currency in a way, and that has enormous potential, and that's something as a commission, Leeds Climate Commission, we're exploring very actively at the moment. So there is a scheme coming which would enable that. And to me that's a kind of maybe a light green version of a dark green version of a full currency, but it's one which has enormous potential. Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm a master's student at the University of Leeds, studying sustainability. This is a question directly for Matt. Now, you mentioned how the media has slightly started to frame climate change in a positive sense. This was demonstrated on Monday during the climate chats, as often the public had heard about the IPCC report, the 12-year review on the media. However, how do you think social media sits in the climate change event in creating awareness and sparking engagement?
Thanks, great question. Social media is fascinating if you're a journalist, because you rely on it, but you don't necessarily always like it very much. In terms of creating engagement, social media is, as we all know, is a large echo chamber, and is often an echo chamber where extreme views get amplified. So actually on the climate change debate, often you can get the two extremes, getting louder and louder and louder, and not a lot in the middle. In fact, there's some fantastic Twitter maps out there which essentially show that there's a lot of engagement, but it's always in those silos. It's hardly ever across. So whether or not it's actually increased the amount of engagement between people who think this is a really big problem and people who don't think this is a big problem, I'll be really skeptical about. But as you've kind of identified there, what it has done is it means when there is a really great climate change story and someone like DSMOG, which is a small outlet, can put our journalism out there about this, what we think is a really fascinating climate change related story, it gives us an opportunity to reach a much larger audience than we ever could have before. From our perspective, that's really positive, and I think with other specialist media outlets, climate change journalists and media outlets, that's also potentially a positive thing too. So it does mean that maybe stories that other people wouldn't have previously seen, they maybe now get seen. But I'm not entirely convinced that it increases positive engagement.
Okay, one more question and then we have to move on. So go ahead.
Ian Fraser, I'm wondering what sort of big national policy changes would help accelerate the transition off fossil fuels.
Anybody want to take that?
Well, the obvious one that would really work would be a carbon tax. So that is the sort of pathway to get to this magic world of zero carbon in 2050 in IPCC world that I come from. They do all generally, they don't all generally, but they all have some carbon pricing mechanism of some kind. So I think without the overthrow of capitalism, we are looking at some way of trying to put some economic kind of value on that quantity of carbon dioxide. And the alternative way to do it, perhaps your idea of community currency idea, or your idea of trying to make the polluter kind of pay, but it comes down to big financial incentives, and it can be the investor top down or from the bottom up. That's basically what we need. It needs to be about the cash.
Piers, do you think that's more likely with Brexit? One hospital passed back to another. Okay.
Well, it is in one particular area, which I'm not, I'm becoming sounding more kind of Tory every day, but it is with the common agriculture policy. We have an opportunity to turn that into a zero carbon land management and food security kind policy. So I think there are some opportunities there.
Great, thank you. We have to start to wrap up, and one of the most frequent questions we were asked in the survey is about, how to turn a global problem into something that individuals can do something about. So can we ask each of the panellists, and if we go from Lisa and along to James, to say, if there were one or perhaps two things you could suggest that we as individuals can do to act on climate change, what would they be? So just a minute or so for each person, please. Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, so I think in some ways this sort of meeting that we've had here has been really interesting in terms of getting informed, all of us getting a little bit more informed, including those of us on the panel and people in the audience, about what some of the issues are. And I think one of the things that maybe might be interesting to explore, and it relates a little bit to the social media question as well, is this kind of idea of peer pressure. Can we try to influence other people's attitudes and then behaviours to actually take action and try and get people to do a little bit, or maybe quite a lot, of everything, of many of the measures that we've actually heard here today. So I think it would be interesting to try and understand whether peer pressure itself, I mean, we all sort of are probably sat here and all of us are probably really concerned about climate change, but how do we reach those people that aren't in this room and that maybe aren't quite so concerned? Is there something that we can sort of take and use a kind of network approach to try and make some big changes there? And then the final thing in terms of the peer pressure again comes back to trying to influence our policymakers as well to really make a change through fear of us not voting them back in. That would be great if we could do that.
Stop working, stop producing, make love, not carbon dioxide. So that's great.
There's the Twitter highlight.
I'm not sure I can
Hayley,
follow
you
that. Right, okay. Well, mine was a bit more boring than yours.
Good. You're going to still probably can have your job at the end of the day.
Excellent. Okay, so I was going to say something. I mean, something that's come up a couple of times actually during this debate already. But I was recently very fortunate to be invited to a meeting in the Arctic Circle, and it was a think tank, and we were really talking about green financing, and it had the World Bank, the Bank of England, all the representation from all the major financial institutions talking about navigating climate risks. So a couple of climate scientists, including myself, there. And I mean, I think that one of the things I took away from that meeting is, one, there's a lot of acronyms in the financial world. And it really took me a long time to navigate those. But two, actually, even as individuals, there is something we can do that perhaps we don't think about doing, and that's thinking about our investment decisions. And it has come up a few times today. And I think one of the things the government can do is to make all companies disclose their carbon emissions, and then we can decide as individuals which companies we actually invest into, which are green, which are brown, as they call them, in the financial world. But also, we can, as individuals, we can think about what energy companies we decide to buy energy from. Do they have a mix of more renewables, for example? Can we lobby to actually get our pension funds, for example, investing in green industry, etc., etc. So, I mean, I would like to see a bit more of that, perhaps, from individuals.
Great. Sarah.
I think I'm going to build on that and say that it's about our roles as citizens and the need to get political. So I would say, in the first instance, if climate change is important to you, your MP should know it's important to you, and your MP should know that you're not going to vote for them and they will lose their job unless they start taking climate change seriously in the way that they vote, in the policies that they put forward. I would say that you might wish to vote differently, so you might want to vote for we're all, so I'm a member of the Green Party, and I've been doing lots of kind of canvassing in Manchester, and often people say, who do you vote for? Well, I vote for this particular party because I've always done. so. Well, why? Why have you always done so? If there are things that party don't sit with you, don't sit with your values, then don't give them your vote. Give your vote to someone else that does reflect the person you are and not the person that you were kind of brought up.
Matt.
So I'm going to challenge the question slightly and say, well, the first answer is, I think the panelists have reflected this, don't be an individual. Be a member of the community. Get informed, talk about climate change, help spread knowledge, whatever you want to call it, about this issue, knowledge, passion. And a part of that, I think, is telling your climate story. This is a severely emotional issue. You can get lost in the dry technicalities of the science or sometimes the policy scenarios. But far smarter people than me have called this the greatest challenge of a generation. This is going to completely destroy communities in certain parts of the world. It's going to really affect people in the poorest parts of the world because of actions that are taken in the richest parts of the world. This is a story about democracy. It's a story about equality. A story about fear. In some cases, it's a story about love. The love for the environment, the love for your fellow person. So tell that. Add the emotion into what can sometimes be quite a boring story. I hope it wasn't tonight, by the way. Add the emotion to what can be sometimes quite a dry story. Tell your climate story. Get out there and be a member of the community in that way.
Lewis.
I think it's an interesting one because, individuals, all of you have, been good enough to turn up tonight and listen to us, obviously have a massive interest in this subject, and there's probably a whole range of things. I think part of it is, around, I think, two things. I think, first of all, it is a little bit of the peer pressure argument, but part of it is also, again, being clear around what, how if individuals act together, if everybody does something, what a difference that can make. We've got a thing we're doing as part of our clean air zone, which I know is sort of more related to air quality than emissions, but in some ways it's all part of the same argument. We're actually just trying to get people to drive 5 miles a week less. There are lots of individual actions that people can do, but if people just think they're the only person that's doing it, which I think is Matt's point, actually I think it is a way of sharing and trying to collate that information. I look at, as we move forward, some of the work we're doing here and some of the things we're doing, it's actually trying to get people to share what they're doing so people can see that other people are doing the same things as I do. And that making and that's making a difference. So I don't directly have the answer to it or have a kind of magic bullet that can solve it all, but I do think trying to find a way of, like I say, of people sharing their individual actions so people know they're part of a crowd and part of a community. I think the way I look at the way that in some parts of the world, in fact in some parts of Leeds, suddenly, or not suddenly, but people cycling to work has become a great collective thing. You come into some routes into Leeds and you see loads of people cycling. You come into other routes in Leeds, you see nobody cycling. Frustratingly, sometimes the routes that we spent a huge amount of money building cycle lanes on, but it is there is something about that. It is it is about getting that kind of, it might be a crude term to use, a bit of a herd mentality, which isn't what an individual can do, but I think individuals can build up towards that.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the questions from the floor, both those we received in advance and the ones that came later. Thanks to all of our panellists and to Christine Talbot for her introduction too. We also want to thank the other universities and institutions that have worked with us on this, especially universities of Newcastle, York and Manchester, who unfortunately sometimes we have to compete with, but more often we would love to collaborate, and I think tonight has been an example of that, which is really, really welcome. Thanks to Leeds City Council for having us here tonight and for enabling us to use this fantastic chamber. Thank you for allowing me to sit in this massive throne all evening.
You can't take it home with you.
Oh, really? It's a shame. Also, thank you very much to Kate and to Shona for all of the effort they put into organising this. It's been a ton of work and effort. There are other events happening through the week as part of Green Great Britain Week. In particular, the one tomorrow at Opera North's Howard Assembly Room at 12:30 p.m, which is a free lunchtime lecture called Unfrozen, Reports from the Ice. And includes a live link up with the British Antarctic Survey, so slightly more visual perhaps than this evening. And also that will be live streamed on the University of Leeds YouTube channel too. You can still get involved in the Twitter campaign for the day. and respond to the question of what does climate change mean to you in a word of 9 letters or less using the hashtag #MyClimate, and we'll put it up on the platform. We could have asked that to the panel, but yeah, goodness knows what we would have got. And then, last of all, if you would like to find out more about how to reduce your own carbon footprint, we have leaflets outside with information and lots of useful links too, and more via our website. And lastly, can I put in a plug? And my last comment, I suppose, would be that the whole point of the Leeds Climate Commission was to empower and energise the city into being able to act on climate change with the kind of nominal label of can-do cities. And my feeling is that if we can change this into a positive thing and create and sell and promote a positive vision of a better future, it's much more likely to be successful than one which is trying to sell a kind of more negative vision of what we need to do and what we need to sacrifice in order to do that. And this is a really tricky question which we as social sciences are often grappling with. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you found it interesting. We would love to see you at future events from the Priestley International Climate Centre and look forward to talking to you afterwards too, hopefully. Thank you very much.